Francis Collins earned a PhD in physical chemistry at Yale University. And then he entered medical school. During his training at a North Carolina hospital, he was working with a woman who was dying, and she would often talk about her faith in Christ. Francis Collins rejected the existence of God, but he couldn't ignore the woman's peace as she faced death. One day she asked him, she said, "What do you believe?" Caught off guard, Collins' face turned red as he stammered, I'm not really sure. A few days later, the woman died. Curious and uneasy, the young doctor realized that he'd rejected God without adequately examining the evidence. He began to read the Bible and the writings of C.S. Lewis, and a year later, he fell to his knees and gave his life to Christ. What was the catalyst to cause this man's conversion? It was a sincere question. It was a question. This morning, as we look at this passage where Jesus cleanses the temple, I want us to consider the place of questions in our life as followers of Jesus Christ. Where do questions fit into our life and our faith? As we saw in this opening story, questions are often tools that God uses to draw us to himself. But what about after we're already Christians? Is it still okay to have questions about God? If we have questions, does that mean our faith is weak? Our passage for this morning is John chapter 2, verses 12 through 23. In this text, Jesus goes to Jerusalem to celebrate the Jewish feast, the Jewish celebration called Passover. And when Jesus enters the temple, what he sees there disturbs him so much that he responds dramatically, provocatively, aggressively, violently. I mean, furniture was broken. Animals were scattered. Coins were flying through the air. In one sense, Jesus' actions are so shocking that they were hard to understand. Think of it this way. Let's imagine that when you got here this morning, you found out that Max Lucado was going to be here, the great Christian writer that all pastors hate because he's so good. That he was going to be here today, and you were real excited because you wanted to hear him and see him in person. And when he got to church this morning, this man of God becomes aggressive and starts raising his voice and flipping over tables and chasing people out of the building. Be shocking, wouldn't it? His actions would catch you off guard. You'd be confused. What is Max doing? Well, confusion was the reaction of the Jewish religious leaders at the temple that day that Jesus cleansed it. But it was also the reaction of the disciples. Jesus' followers were also confused. What was he doing? Well, let me set the stage for Jesus' aggressive actions and realize that we're going to get to the questions about faith later. Jesus is in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city. It's the political, it's the social, and it's the religious center of Israel and Judaism. Jesus is in Jerusalem to celebrate the Jewish feast called Passover. The book of John here records Jesus going to 3 Passovers. This is the first Passover. There was another Passover the next year, and then the third Passover that Jesus goes to, that's when he's crucified. When he goes to celebrate the Passover that third time, as recorded in the book of John, is when he's crucified. Passover was an annual celebration each spring where God's people retold and relived and celebrated all over again God freeing his people from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. You see, the Egyptian ruler had stubbornly refused to let God's people go. They were enslaved by the Egyptians, and Moses had been begging the ruler to let God's people go. He sent a series of plagues, and the last plague, God sent an angel of death to kill the firstborn male in each home in Egypt. But this angel of death would pass over and therefore spare any home where a lamb had been killed, sacrificed, and the blood of that lamb had been sprinkled on the door of the home. God told his people, the Jews, to sacrifice the lamb and sprinkle the blood. They did, and they were saved. Well, after the angel of death had come, and the Egyptian ruler, the Pharaoh, in his anguish because he lost his firstborn son, he released God's people. Over the centuries that followed, the Passover feast became a celebration that Jews celebrated. It was the highlight of the year, and Jews from all over were required to come and celebrate in Jerusalem their deliverance from slavery. And since part of this celebration of the Passover was to make sacrifices in the temple, we find Jesus going to the temple to celebrate the Passover events. And as Jesus walked into the temple during the crowded celebration of the Passover, he finds men selling cattle and sheep and doves and other men sitting at tables exchanging money. And you see, with all of those pilgrims coming to offer sacrifices of animals, and all of those people traveling from distant lands to go to Jerusalem, it was impractical for most of them to bring their animal sacrifice with them. And so the local merchants would supply local animals for the pilgrims to sacrifice. Unfortunately, as is human nature, these merchants charged marked up prices for these animals that were going to be sacrificed. And these merchants were selling these animals in the temple courts. And so the temple courts came to resemble more a marketplace than a place of worship. And then on top of this, there was a temple tax that every Jew over the age of 19 had to pay. And the temple would not receive just any coins. They had to be the temple currency. And so all of these Jews who traveled from all over the world to come to the temple would have to exchange their pagan money for temple money. The pagan money had pagan leaders' images on the coins. And so they'd have to exchange that money for temple money. And thus, there were money changers who were in the temple as well to exchange the foreign currency for Jewish money. And again, as can be expected, these money changers charged a high price for their services. We read all of this in just one verse, in verse 14 of our passage, in John chapter 2, verse 14. It says, "In the temple courts, Jesus found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money."